The office hummed with the familiar energy of a Monday morning. Quickened footsteps echoed through the halls, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards filled the air, and the low murmur of voices carried discussions of deadlines and projects. At her desk, Sarah, a seasoned marketing manager, meticulously arranged her notes for an important presentation. Her expression was composed, yet her body revealed subtle signs of her pregnancy: the gentle swell of her belly, the slight puffiness of her ankles, and the unmistakable glow that only those closest to her seemed to notice. Despite the physical changes, her commitment to her work had not wavered. She had been a pillar of the company for years, consistently delivering exceptional results, always meeting deadlines, and going beyond what was expected. But today felt different. An email had arrived earlier that morning from Robert Whitman, the company's CEO. It had been brief, devoid of warmth, and provided no hint of the purpose behind the meeting he had scheduled with her. A knot of unease tightened in Sarah's stomach as she walked toward his office. Whitman's reputation preceded him. He was a man of sharp precision, ruthless in his pursuit of profitability. Employees spoke in hushed tones about his cold efficiency, about how he had dismissed people without hesitation, reducing careers to nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet. She knocked lightly on his door. "Come in," his deep voice commanded. Taking a steadying breath, Sarah stepped inside, gripping a folder filled with her accomplishments. If this meeting was about her performance, she wanted to be prepared. Whitman sat behind his grand mahogany desk, his sharp suit and unyielding gaze exuding power. His eyes fixed on her as she took a seat, the scrutiny making her feel small, despite the confidence she held in her work. "Sarah," he began, his voice devoid of warmth, "let's not waste time. I've gone over the team's recent performance, and while your contributions are significant, there's a matter we need to address." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "An issue?" she asked carefully. "If there's anything that needs improvement, I'm more than willing to address it." Whitman leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "This isn't about your work," he said, his tone as cold as steel. "It's about your condition." Sarah's brows furrowed. "My condition?" "Your pregnancy." The word fell from his lips with brutal finality. "You've done well so far, but let's be realistic. A woman in your position can't possibly maintain the same level of performance while dealing with personal distractions. You'll need time off soon, and when you return, you'll be splitting your focus between a child and your career. That isn't sustainable for someone in your role." The air was suddenly thick, suffocating. Sarah's heart pounded as disbelief washed over her. "With all due respect, my pregnancy has not affected my work. I've managed my responsibilities effectively, and I've even adjusted my schedule to ensure that nothing slips through the cracks." Whitman waved a dismissive hand. "That's beside the point. The company needs employees who are fully committed, not ones who are stretched thin by outside obligations. I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." The words struck her like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. "You're firing me?" "Because I'm pregnant?" Whitman's expression remained unyielding. "This isn't personal, Sarah. It's about what's best for the company. I've already spoken to HR. You'll receive a severance package, along with assistance in finding a new job if necessary." Sarah felt an ache rise in her chest, a lump forming in her throat, but she refused to break. She lifted her chin, steadying her voice even as emotion threatened to consume her. "This is wrong," she said firmly. "It's discrimination, plain and simple. I've sacrificed so much for this company. Late nights, weekends, my best ideas. I have given you everything. And this is how I'm repaid?" Whitman merely shrugged, his indifference cutting deeper than any sharp words could. "Here's a rewritten version of your passage with deeper emotional resonance and a more immersive flow. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments." Whitman's indifference cut deeper than his words ever could. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unmoved, as if firing Sarah was nothing more than checking off another task on his to-do list. "Life isn't fair, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the weight of dismissal. "But business is business. I'm sure you'll land on your feet." Something inside her snapped. Her hands trembled as she rose to her feet, her breath uneven, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had held herself together for as long as she could, but the sheer injustice of it all burned through her composure. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice thick with restrained emotion. "It's about every woman who has been punished for choosing to have a family. You might think you've won today, but this isn't over." Whitman didn't react. He simply glanced at his watch, already moving on from the conversation. That apathy, that complete lack of regard for the years of dedication she had given, was what broke her. Without another word, Sarah turned and walked out of the office, her head high, despite the tears that threatened to spill. The air outside Whitman's office felt heavier, charged with unspoken questions, as her colleagues stole curious glances at her. They sensed something had happened, but no one dared ask. She didn't stop. She gathered her belongings in silence, ignoring the lump in her throat, the sting in her chest, the urge to collapse into her chair and scream. Instead, she stepped out of the building she had called home for years and didn't look back. That evening, Sarah sat on the couch, curled against her husband, Michael, as she recounted the events of the day. Her voice wavered, the rawness of it all settling in as she spoke Whitman's words aloud. Michael listened intently, his jaw tightening with each sentence, his hands clenched into fists. When she finished, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head in quiet fury. "That man has no idea who he's dealing with," he said, his voice calm but brimming with a restrained anger that sent chills down Sarah's spine. She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "There's nothing we can do. He's the CEO. He has all the power." Michael turned to her, placing a firm yet gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maybe he does, but that doesn't make him untouchable. Trust me, Sarah. We'll figure this out." Her walls finally crumbled. The tears she had fought all day spilled over as she whispered, "I just wanted to do my job. I didn't deserve this." Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried, his mind already racing. His anger wasn't just an emotional reaction, it was a call to action. Whitman had crossed a line, and Michael was not the kind of man to let something like this slide. What Sarah didn't know was that her husband's influence stretched far beyond what even Whitman could imagine. His connections ran deep within the corporate world, his reach extending to the very boardrooms where men like Whitman believed they were untouchable. As Sarah finally drifted into an exhausted sleep that night, Michael sat in his study, making phone calls, pulling strings, setting things into motion. This wasn't just about justice. It was about making sure no other woman had to face what his wife had. The battle had only just begun. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. Anger, despair, frustration. They all took turns suffocating Sarah, leaving her restless and hollow. The severance package Whitman had so graciously offered barely covered a few months' worth of expenses, a cold reminder of just how little she had meant to them in the end. Worse than the financial strain was the emotional wound that festered inside her. The betrayal wasn't just from Whitman, but from a system that allowed men like him to operate without consequence. A system that made women like her feel disposable the moment they dared to have a life beyond their jobs. But while Sarah was drowning in self-doubt, Michael was a force of unwavering determination. "You need to fight back," he told her one evening, his voice steely with conviction. "What Whitman did isn't just wrong. It's illegal. We need to get a lawyer." Sarah hesitated, exhaustion weighing on her. "What good will that do?" "He's the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. Even if I have a case, they have the resources to drag it out, to bury me in paperwork until I give up." Michael's expression hardened. "That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." And that was what made her pause, because he was right. She had spent the past few days drowning in her own pain, believing she had lost. But maybe she hadn't. Maybe she still had a fight left in her. With renewed determination, Sarah reached out to an old friend who specialized in labor law. The consultation was long, filled with legal jargon and possible outcomes. But one thing was clear: she had a strong case. A case that could shake Whitman's carefully crafted empire. Meanwhile, back at the office, Whitman carried on as if nothing had happened. To him, Sarah's termination was nothing more than a strategic decision, a move to streamline the workforce, to make space for employees he deemed more reliable. He never spared a second thought for the woman he had so easily discarded, but soon he would have no choice, because Sarah wasn't done fighting, and neither was Michael. Here's your passage rewritten with deeper emotion, richer detail, and a stronger flow while maintaining the core of the story. Not everyone in the company shared Whitman's enthusiasm. In fact, the atmosphere within the office had shifted drastically in the wake of Sarah's firing. News of her abrupt dismissal spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of outrage among employees. Sarah had been more than just a respected colleague. She had been a mentor, a leader, and a source of inspiration for many. Now, her absence cast a heavy shadow, leaving behind an unspoken but chilling realization. If they could do this to Sarah, they could do it to any of us. Conversations in the break room grew hushed and tense, whispered exchanges taking place in hallways and over coffee cups. Employees spoke in urgent tones, their words laced with unease and resentment. "This isn't just about Sarah," one employee murmured, shaking their head. "It's about all of us. If they can toss her aside like that, what's stopping them from doing the same to anyone else?" Among those most deeply affected was Linda, Sarah's former assistant. She had worked closely with Sarah for years and had seen firsthand the relentless dedication she poured into her work. She had watched Sarah stay late, sacrifice weekends, and go the extra mile for her team, only to be discarded the moment her personal life was deemed an inconvenience. A deep sense of guilt gnawed at Linda. She had been there, sitting in that office when Sarah walked out for the last time, but she had done nothing. She hadn't spoken up, hadn't fought for the woman who had always fought for others. And now, that regret weighed on her like a stone. One afternoon, as she made her way past the break room, Linda overheard a hushed but heated conversation between two of her colleagues. "Did you hear what Whitman said about her?" one of them whispered, disbelief clear in their voice. "He practically admitted he fired her because she's pregnant." "Yeah, but what can we do?" the other replied, frustration seeping into their tone. "He's the CEO. He holds all the power." Linda felt something inside her harden. No, she thought, not this time. She couldn't change what had already happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could help set things right. A fire ignited within her, pushing aside the guilt and replacing it with resolve. That night, she began collecting everything she could: emails, meeting notes, company policies, anything that might serve as evidence of the injustice Sarah had faced. If Whitman thought he could simply erase Sarah from the company's history, he was sorely mistaken. Meanwhile, another plan was unfolding. As Sarah and her legal team prepared for the battle ahead, Michael was orchestrating a plan of his own, one he had yet to reveal to his wife. To most, Michael appeared to be nothing more than a supportive husband, standing by Sarah as she fought for justice. What few people knew, however, was that he was far more than that. Michael was a force in the corporate world, a businessman whose influence extended into circles even Whitman himself would not dare challenge. What Sarah had never realized, because Michael had deliberately kept it from her, was that he wasn't just well-connected. He was powerful. Over the years, Michael had built an empire of his own, acquiring companies, forging alliances, and quietly amassing control in industries where men like Whitman believed they were untouchable. And, unbeknownst to both Sarah and Whitman, one of Michael's latest acquisitions had given him a significant stake in Whitman's own company. He had never shared this with Sarah, not wanting to overshadow her success or make her feel as though his influence had played any role in her career. But now, as he watched the woman he loved suffer at the hands of a man who saw her as nothing more than a disposable asset, Michael realized that silence was no longer an option. Over the next several weeks, Michael began attending board meetings under the guise of an investor representative. Whitman barely noticed him, dismissing him as just another faceless executive in a sea of business suits. But Michael wasn't there to observe. He was there to dismantle. He studied Whitman's management style, taking careful note of the toxic culture the CEO had cultivated, one driven by greed, ego, and a callous disregard for the well-being of his employees. And as Michael gathered information, he began reaching out to other board members, subtly planting the seeds of doubt. "Is this really the kind of leader we need steering the company?" he would ask in private conversations. "Someone who fires a top performer because she's pregnant? What message does that send to our investors? To our employees?" He was patient, methodical. He didn't push, he simply suggested. But those suggestions took root, growing into quiet concerns, then murmurs of discontent, and finally into something more dangerous: doubt in Whitman's leadership. Sarah's fight gains momentum. While Michael was working behind the scenes, Sarah was beginning to feel a renewed sense of purpose. The fire she thought had been extinguished inside her had instead transformed into something even stronger, a fierce determination to fight. Her attorney had filed an official complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, and the case was already gaining traction. What had started as a private battle was quickly becoming something much larger. Then, the media got hold of the story. Within days, Sarah's name was everywhere. News outlets began reporting on her case, framing her as a courageous whistleblower standing up against corporate injustice. Interviews were requested, headlines were written, and before she even had time to process it, her story had taken on a life of its own. The response was overwhelming. Social media erupted with outrage, flooded with stories from women who had faced similar discrimination in their own workplaces. The hashtag #Justice for Sarah began trending, amplifying her voice far beyond anything she could have imagined. Sarah sat on the couch one evening, scrolling through post after post. Women, men, even entire organizations standing in solidarity with her. It was surreal. Just days ago, she had felt powerless. Now she was at the center of a movement. She looked up at Michael, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. "This is bigger than me now," she whispered, the realization hitting her all at once. Michael nodded, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Yes," he said, "and Whitman has no idea what's coming." Though Sarah had received an outpouring of support, an unease lingered beneath the surface. The attention surrounding her case was growing, and with it came a creeping sense of doubt. One evening, as she sat beside Michael, the weight of it all became too much to keep inside. "What if this backfires?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if people start thinking I'm just trying to stir up trouble?" Michael took her hands gently, his touch grounding her. He looked into her eyes, steady and unwavering. "Sarah," he said softly, "you're not alone in this. You're standing up for what's right, and people can see that. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been treated unfairly and thought they had no one to fight for them." She exhaled slowly, her shoulders still tense with uncertainty. Michael gave her a small, knowing smile. "And besides," he added, "you have more allies than you realize." She frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. But something in his voice, something in the quiet confidence he carried, gave her strength. A shift in power. The true turning point came during a highly anticipated board meeting, one that Whitman had entered with his usual arrogance, fully expecting to maintain control. Seated at the head of the long, polished conference table, he addressed the room with the same self-assured bravado that had once commanded respect. He dismissed the growing controversy as nothing more than a temporary PR setback, assuring the board that it would soon blow over. In his mind, Sarah's firing had been the correct decision, and that was the end of it. But as the meeting progressed, something shifted. The faces around the table, once nodding in agreement with his every word, were now guarded. Some board members who had always been staunch allies remained noticeably quiet, while others exchanged uncertain glances. A heavy silence hung over the room, one that Whitman hadn't expected. And then, after sitting patiently for most of the meeting, Michael finally spoke. "Mr. Whitman," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "what do you have to say about the accusations of discrimination against you?" Whitman's jaw tightened. He exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across his face. "I've already addressed this," he said tersely. "Sarah Johnson's termination was based on performance. It was a necessary decision for the company. This whole thing has been blown wildly out of proportion." Michael leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze unwavering. "And you don't believe that firing a pregnant employee sends a harmful message?" he pressed. "What kind of culture are you fostering here?" Whitman's face flushed with irritation. "With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, you don't know the full story." A slow, knowing smile formed on Michael's lips. "Oh," he said smoothly, "I think I do." The room fell into stunned silence as Michael pushed back his chair and stood. His presence suddenly felt even larger, commanding every eye in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the board, his tone measured but firm. "As the representative of this company's largest stakeholder, I believe it's time we reevaluate Mr. Whitman's leadership." For the first time in his career, Whitman looked rattled. His lips parted slightly, disbelief etched into his features. "You're the largest stakeholder?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "And as of now," he continued, "I am recommending that we begin discussions to replace the CEO." The room erupted into murmurs. Whitman sat frozen, his world unraveling before his eyes. He had dismissed Michael as just another investor, an unimportant figure in a sea of executives. Now he realized his mistake. And Michael wasn't finished. "But before we proceed," he added, "I suggest we find a way to make amends to Miss Sarah Johnson, because let me assure you, this isn't over." The aftermath. What followed that fateful meeting would change everything. Sarah, exhausted from weeks of legal battles, had been doing everything she could to build her case. She had spent countless hours with her attorney, meticulously gathering evidence, preparing statements, reliving the injustice over and over again. And despite her unwavering resolve, the weight of it all was crushing. There were nights she questioned if it was even worth it. But every time doubt threatened to consume her, Michael was there, strong, unshaken, reminding her why she had started this fight in the first place. Meanwhile, the pressure on Whitman intensified. The scandal surrounding Sarah's firing had reached far beyond the office walls, tarnishing the company's reputation at an alarming rate. Customers were speaking out, voicing their disapproval across social media. Business partners, once loyal and unwavering, were quietly reconsidering their affiliations. For the first time in his career, Whitman was realizing that power wasn't just about holding a title. It was about the trust of those who followed you. And his, it seemed, was slipping away. The board of directors was no longer simply concerned about bad press. They had begun receiving anonymous complaints from employees detailing the toxic work environment Whitman had fostered. What had once been whispered in break rooms was now reaching their desks in formal complaints. His unchecked arrogance, they realized, wasn't just damaging the company's reputation, it was jeopardizing its future. And behind the scenes, Michael continued to move like a silent force. Without revealing his full connection to Sarah, he carefully built alliances among the board members. He wasn't aggressive, nor did he need to be. He simply planted seeds of doubt, raised questions that lingered in the minds of those in power, and slowly, steadily, the tide began to turn. The breaking point came during a high-stakes investor meeting held in a sleek boardroom adorned with plaques and accolades, a reflection of past successes. But on that day, the air was thick with tension. Whitman walked in, still clinging to his facade of confidence. But there was something different about his posture. His steps were just a little less assured, his grip on his notes just a little too tight. He had anticipated pushback, of course. He was prepared to spin the controversy in his favor, as he always had. What he hadn't anticipated was Michael. Dressed in a sharp suit, exuding an effortless air of authority, Michael was already seated at the table, watching Whitman with a quiet intensity. Whitman barely spared him a glance, still unaware of the man's true significance. As the meeting began, Whitman launched into a carefully rehearsed speech, painting the company's future in broad, optimistic strokes. He minimized the controversy, calling it a misunderstanding, a distraction blown out of proportion. Then Michael raised his hand. "Mr. Whitman," he said, his voice cutting through the room with quiet force, "I have a few questions about your recent management decisions, particularly the termination of a senior employee, Sarah Johnson. Could you elaborate on why you believe this was in the best interest of the company?" Whitman stiffened. "As I've stated before," he said, his tone clipped, "the decision was based on performance and aligning the team with long-term goals." Michael tilted his head slightly. "Interesting," he mused, "because from what I've gathered, Miss Johnson was one of the most dedicated and high-performing employees on your team. It seems her termination had less to do with performance and more to do with her personal circumstances." A ripple of tension spread through the room. Board members exchanged glances. Whitman's face darkened. "With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, you're not privy to the full details." Michael's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps not," he said, "but I am privy to the fact that your decision has resulted in a PR disaster and has alienated both employees and investors." Whitman opened his mouth to speak, but Michael lifted a hand, stopping him cold. "Before you continue," he said smoothly, "let me formally introduce myself. My name is Michael Johnson, and I'm not just an investor in this company. I'm the majority stakeholder." The room fell deathly silent, and for the first time in his life, Whitman had nothing to say. The weight of Michael's words settled over the boardroom like a heavy storm cloud, silent yet impossible to ignore. The air crackled with tension, every breath held as the realization sank in, and then, in a voice laced with quiet determination, he delivered the final blow. "If you're still wondering," Michael continued, his gaze unwavering, "Sarah Johnson is my wife." The revelation struck Whitman like a freight train, leaving him momentarily stunned, his usual arrogance evaporating into thin air. His eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for a lifeline, a shred of support from the other board members. But none met his gaze. Their silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Michael rose to his feet, his presence commanding, his tone unshakable. "Let me make one thing abundantly clear," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unyielding authority. "I've been watching how you've run this company, watching the choices you've made, watching the way you treat the very people who built this organization with their dedication and hard work. And I must say, Mr. Whitman, I am deeply disappointed." Whitman swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if trying to steady himself. I wasn't aware of your connection to Sarah," he stammered, his voice faltering. "If I had known—" Michael cut him off with a sharp, controlled tone. "That's precisely the problem, Mr. Whitman. You didn't take the time to know your employees, to understand the people who give their lives to this company. You dismissed Sarah as if she were nothing, assuming she was expendable. But let me tell you something, she is not, and neither are the countless others you've mistreated." The room remained eerily still, the weight of Michael's words pressing down on everyone in attendance. Slowly he turned to address the board, his voice lowering to a steady, unwavering force. "I propose we vote on Mr. Whitman's continued role as CEO," he announced, "because this company needs leadership that values its employees, leadership that understands the meaning of integrity. It's time for a change." One by one, the board members nodded in agreement, the momentum shifting like a tidal wave. Whitman's expression crumbled from disbelief to desperation as he realized the walls were closing in. His empire, built on arrogance and indifference, was crumbling before his very eyes. Later that evening, Sarah sat on the couch, her hands trembling slightly as she held the phone to her ear. Michael's voice came through, steady and sure. "It's done," he told her. "Whitman is out." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, a mix of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. "You're incredible," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you did this for me." Michael's reply was immediate, unwavering. "I'd do it 1,000 times over, Sarah. But this wasn't just for you. This was about standing up to a system that treats people like disposable cogs in a machine. It was about making sure no one else has to go through what you did. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the crushing weight on her chest begin to lift. With Michael by her side, she knew they could face anything. The next morning, the corporate world woke to a seismic shift. Whitman's termination as CEO was publicly announced. The news spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the industry. Employees who had endured years of mistreatment under his rule rejoiced. For them, it was more than just a change in leadership. It was justice, long overdue. Despite the victory, Sarah found herself sitting in her living room, staring out the window, her mind racing. The fight had been won, but what came next? What did this mean for her, for the company, for their future? Michael wasted no time stepping into his new role as interim CEO. Though he had remained composed during the board meeting, he knew the real battle was just beginning. The company's reputation had been battered, employee morale was at an all-time low, and the damage caused by Whitman's toxic leadership was far-reaching. His first act was to address the employees directly. He called for an all-hands meeting, ensuring that every person, from top executives to entry-level workers, had a chance to be heard. As he stepped onto the stage in the vast auditorium, the room buzzed with anticipation. Many had only known him as a name on a list, a shadow in the background. Now they watched him with cautious hope. Michael took a deep breath, his voice carrying the weight of promise and change. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Johnson, and as of today, I'm stepping in as the interim CEO of this company. I know that the past few months, years even, have been difficult, but I want you to hear this from me. Change is coming. He paused, letting the words settle. This company is built on the hard work and dedication of its employees. It's time we start valuing that. Starting today, we are implementing new policies to ensure that every voice is heard, every contribution is recognized, and every employee is treated with the respect they deserve. The applause that followed was thunderous, the first genuine burst of hope the company had seen in a long time. Meanwhile, Michael had one more plan in mind, one that was deeply personal. One afternoon, as Sarah prepared to pick up their daughter from daycare, he approached her with a knowing smile, holding out a sealed envelope. She raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is this?" "Open it and see," he said, his voice warm with anticipation. With hesitant fingers, she unfolded the letter inside. Her breath caught in her throat as she read. Dear Sarah Johnson, we are pleased to formally reinstate you to your position as Senior Project Manager, effective immediately. Furthermore, we would like to offer our sincerest apologies for the unfair treatment you experienced. Your dedication and contributions have always been invaluable to this organization. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she looked up at Michael, her voice shaking. You didn't have to do this. Michael cupped her face gently, his gaze filled with nothing but love. Yes, I did. You earned this, Sarah. And this isn't just about you, it's about setting a precedent. No one should ever be treated the way you were. Months passed, and the company underwent a profound transformation. Under Michael's leadership, integrity and respect became the foundation of every decision. New policies encouraged work-life balance, better benefits, and opportunities for professional growth. Employees felt seen, heard, valued. And Sarah? She became more than just an employee. She became a mentor, a leader, a beacon of resilience and justice. She used her platform to empower others, especially women and individuals from underrepresented backgrounds, urging them to chase their ambitions fearlessly. One evening, as Sarah and Michael sat on their back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she exhaled deeply. You know, she murmured, sipping her tea, there were moments I thought I'd never recover from what happened. But looking back, I see it now. It was a turning point. Not just for me, but for so many others. Michael smiled, his fingers entwining with hers. It's incredible what happens when people stand together and refuse to accept injustice. You showed immense strength, Sarah. You didn't just inspire me, You inspired everyone." Their daughter's laughter rang through the air, pure and unburdened. And in that moment they knew the fight had been worth it. The world was changing, and they were a part of it.